Lurkers explores the dark side of the online world. It contains adult themes and disturbing content for mature audiences only.
A vertical frame lights up. A woman leans into it from the driver's seat. Close, centered, like she knows exactly where the lens is. She holds the phone out in front of her, sunglasses on. The car feels small around her. Daylight washes in through the windows of a compact sedan, flattening everything into that familiar casual brightness of a social post. She looks straight at the lens, talking to her followers like she's done this before.
I haven't heard from her since. I hope that Sydney is found very soon.
She swallows. Then she adds the line that's supposed to lock you in.
She is a sweet, amazing girl.
And for a second, it works because it sounds like care. It sounds like worry. It sounds like a friend. But the thing about manipulation is it doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like comfort. Sometimes it looks like help. And sometimes the person who says they're trying really hard to find their friend is the one making sure you never do. In a world where connection is effortless, every click feels safe. But online, trust can be deceiving. This is Lurkers, true stories of trust, desire, and how technology, if unchecked, can turn it all against us. Hey friends, how are you doing today? Hope you're doing well because today's episode is a very sad one and it gets pretty vicious. So I wanted to start by telling you that manipulation isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives dressed as something familiar, like friendship, or attraction, or concern. It doesn't force its way in. It gets invited. And when it works, it doesn't just get close. It takes control of the story. So when people start asking questions, the first answers they hear are the ones someone prepared. In this story, two timelines moved at once. In one, the people who loved Sydney were living a normal week. Work, texts, small plans, a tomorrow. In the other, someone set up a trap with a story. And the whole point of a story is that it invites you in before you know the door is closing. So if after hearing Sydney's story, you feel like it's worth passing along, please share this episode with someone you care about. And if you follow Lurkers or leave a quick review, it helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. And seriously friends, it helps more people recognize what can hide behind a screen. As always, thank you for being part of this. Really. Alright, off we go. Sydney Loofe was 24. She lived in Lincoln, Nebraska. She'd grown up in Nilly, about 2.5 hours away. An outdoors kid, active, always moving. But in her teens, she developed scoliosis, a pain that changed what she could do and what she pictured for herself. So she reevaluated, and she moved to Lincoln. She lived there with her cat, Mimsy. She worked as a cashier at a hardware store, and the people around her loved her for the simplest reason. She showed up. She worked hard. She was kind. And she had this way of making other people's lives lighter. Friends in a bind. She didn't just listen. She acted. More than once, she opened her home to someone who needed a fresh start. The kind of help that costs you something, space, time, energy, and she gave it anyway. I am bringing up this point because it matters. Because sometimes the thing you love about someone, their openness, their empathy, can become the exact thing someone else decides to use, not because they did anything wrong, but because the wrong person noticed. And somewhere in that ordinary life, like a lot of people, Sydney had been talking to someone on Tinder. The Associated Press reported it early on. A profile name, Audrey. Then, a few days later on Thursday, November 16, 2017, Sydney didn't show up for work. No call, no text, no, I'm running late. And everyone around her felt it immediately because it wasn't like her. And this is the moment this story splits what the people who loved her could see and what they couldn't. Manipulation isn't just lying. It is tempo. It is knowing when to be warm, when to be quiet, when to mirror someone back to themselves. It is building trust with tiny, harmless-looking moments. So when the moment stops being harmless, you're already inside it. And in Sydney Loofe's story, the most dangerous part wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. It was a profile that felt normal. But to understand how the name Audrey ended up at the center of everything, we have to rewind a couple of nights, back to the part that looked ordinary, back to the part that didn't feel like a warning. Audrey's profile looked clean, casual, nothing that screamed danger. Messages went back and forth, and tone felt easy, light, familiar, low pressure. That kind of conversation that makes you relax before you even notice you were tense. They went on their first in-person date on Tuesday, November 14, 2017. According to the Nebraska Supreme Court's published opinion in State v. Trail, Audrey picked Sydney up around 5:35 p.m. in her car. They drove around Lincoln for nearly 2 hours, just writing, talking, smoking weed, doing that normal first date thing where you feel someone out without calling it that. Nothing sharp, no moment that demanded fear. And when it ended, Audrey dropped Sydney back at her apartment at about 7:15 p.m. It went normal enough, fun enough that a second date got planned for the next night. Then, on Wednesday, November 15, just before 7 p.m., Audrey arrived at Sydney's apartment again. Sydney got in the car, and this time, according to the court record timeline, they didn't stay in Lincoln. They drove to Wilbur, Nebraska, about 45 minutes away, a town of around 1,800, and known for its Czech capital pride. Yes, Czech is in the culture, and Czech days. It comes to my mind right now. You may be asking, why is he telling me this? This is not a culture documentary. Well, the thing is, it does have quiet roads, smaller streets, the kind of place where a car turning around the wrong street stands out, unless no one is looking. Audrey and Sydney arrived at the basement apartment in Wilbur at around 8:08 p.m. And at 8:32 p.m., Sydney's phone communicated with a cell tower for the last time. But no one who loved her knew any of that yet. All they knew was what came next, when Thursday morning arrived and Sydney didn't show up at the hardware store. Okay, let's go back to November 16, 2017. The morning Sydney didn't show up for work. Friends, family, and co-workers reached out with no response, and the longer the silence held, the more it stopped feeling like a mistake, and their own explanations got smaller. Within the next couple of days, her parents drove to her apartment hoping they were simply overreacting. The door opened, and everything inside looked normal. A quiet living room, her stuff where it should be, but Sydney wasn't there. Her car was still outside. There wasn't a packed bag. There wasn't a note, just a space that felt paused. And then the detail that landed hardest. Mimsy, Sydney's cat, still there, still waiting. No food, no water. Sydney would never do that. Not ever. Mimsy wasn't just a pet, she was family. And that's when it stopped being, she's not answering, and instead, she was gone. So the question changed from where is she to who was the last person who saw her? And the first real thread wasn't a witness, it was digital. The profile name Sydney had been talking to, a dating app, a message chain, and one word that suddenly mattered. Audrey. To Sydney's friends, Audrey still wasn't a person. She was a profile, a chat, a hint. So they did what people do when they feel they're running out of time. They try to pull that lead closer. They created a fake profile, matched with Audrey, gained her trust, and got something they could actually hand to police. A phone number. 2 days after Sydney's second date, Sydney's friends gave that number to investigators. After several attempts, police finally reached Audrey on the phone, and at first, her story didn't sound like a confession. It sounded like a lead. She confirmed she had been with Sydney Tuesday, then again Wednesday, and she claimed that when she took Sydney home, Sydney asked to be dropped at a friend's house instead. And she said she hadn't heard from her since. So early on, that possibility stayed alive. What if Sydney had been dropped off and something happened after? What if this was an abduction? The wrong place, at the wrong time, after the date ended? But then the missing person story hit local news and started spreading online. And once the attention started circling around Audrey, she went public. And yes, this is the moment you heard at the beginning of this episode. A vertical video, a woman in a car, her phone held out in front of her, and the tone. Careful, measured, the kind of calm that tries to pass as concern. According to the clip, which you can see in the docuseries Heartline Homicide, she told the world she'd been with Sydney, that they drove around Lincoln and hit it off, that she dropped Sydney off, and hadn't heard from her since. And then, like a prayer, she said she hoped Sydney would be found soon, that she was a sweet, amazing girl. And, I mean, if you were watching with no context, if you were just another person scrolling, maybe it sounded like a friend trying to do the right thing. But for the people searching for Sydney, and investigators, it did something else. It planted a version of events, a timeline, a clean, simple explanation that made Audrey look cooperative. Now the search wasn't just about finding Sydney. It was about figuring out whether the person claiming to help was telling the truth. But the more Audrey talked, the more it started to feel like the story had been rehearsed. Because in the other timeline, whatever happened in Wilbur had already happened, and in this version of events, everyone was still trying really hard to catch up. By the time Audrey went public, investigators already had her story. Now they had to test it, because in a missing person case, a clean timeline can be help, or it can be camouflage. So they did what you always do next. They ran her. Not the persona, the person behind it. And that's when the first crack opened. Audrey wasn't Audrey at all. Her real name was Bailey Boswell. And that nice normal Tinder profile didn't match the real world paper trail. Bailey had a fraud history, more than a dozen federal charges, allegations involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now investigators weren't just asking where did Sydney go, they were asking who had she really been with. And then came the detail that snapped the two timelines into the same frame. Bailey's address in Wilbur. You've already heard that name. 45 minutes from Lincoln, the same town where, in the other timeline, Sydney's phone last communicated with a cell tower. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was geography. It was proximity. It was a straight line between a story and a place. Police executed a search warrant at the basement apartment in Wilbur. Nope, Sydney wasn't there. Bailey wasn't there either. And the apartment didn't feel lived in. It felt erased. Thoroughly cleaned. Too clean. And with an empty apartment and a missing suspect, investigators started to believe the worst had already happened. Now this wasn't just a search for Sydney Loofe. It was a hunt for the person who'd last been with her, and the story Bailey had been telling everyone to believe. Because the Wilbur apartment didn't just point to Bailey, it suggested something else, something colder than a solo lie. That night, the night Sydney vanished, Bailey wasn't just a date. She wasn't just a profile. She was a door, and investigators came to believe there was another presence moving inside the second timeline. Someone aware of Sydney, even if Sydney had never been aware of him. That possibility changed the shape of the case, because one person can improvise, one person can panic, but two people can plan. And now, with Bailey's identity exposed and the Wilbur apartment searched, investigators expected the next move. Run. Bailey disappeared. For a while, it felt like she could be anywhere, out of town, out of state, gone into the kind of anonymity that the internet is good at providing. But that's where the cameras started talking. Because the problem with disappearing is that you still have to move through the real world. You still have to be a body somewhere, and bodies leave traces. Parking lots, gas stations, doors opening and closing. Cameras that piece together a timeline that doesn't care what you told your followers. Cameras that don't care if you set it in front of a car seat, behind sunglasses, acting like you're helping. So investigators started following them persistently. And that trail came into focus. One detail became impossible to ignore. Bailey wasn't alone. On surveillance footage, hotels, stores, she appeared with an older man. And his name? Aubrey Trail. After several weeks, that persistence paid off. In Missouri, authorities located Bailey and Aubrey Trail. They were taken into custody, and for the people who loved Sydney, it should have been relief. And part of it was. But it wasn't the kind of relief that lets you breathe. because arrests don't answer the question that matters most. Where was Sydney? And what exactly had happened in Wilbur? Once Bailey and Trail were in custody, investigators stopped chasing stories and started building proof. At trial, jurors later saw surveillance from Sydney's workplace, the hardware store, and it mattered because it suggested this wasn't random. It supported what prosecutors argued from the beginning, that what happened to Sydney was premeditated. On the footage, Sydney was leaving. Trail was entering. She didn't react to him, but he noticed her. He turned his head back to watch her as she walked away. Like she wasn't a stranger. Like he already knew exactly who she was. While the legal case began to form, the search on the ground kept moving, out from Wilbur, along county roads and drainage ditches, scanning fields, tree lines, and roadside pull-offs. In December, investigators began locating trash bags along rural roads and ditches west of Wilbur. Multiple sites, spread out, not one place, several. Remember how I told you in the beginning, this was gonna be vicious. Forensic examination confirmed the remains were Sydney Loofe's. The autopsy concluded her cause of death was homicidal violence by strangulation and asphyxiation. There were also findings suggesting her wrists had been restrained. After that, the "I left her at a friend's house" story didn't just collapse. It exposed its purpose because Sydney didn't vanish after the date. The evidence said she never got the chance. And back in that Wilbur basement, where the air had carried bleach and the space had felt too clean, erased, what looked like clean now read as something else: removal.
All rise.
In court, the version Bailey posted online, the calm voice, the sunglasses, the sweet, amazing girl, ran into something it couldn't outtalk: evidence. Prosecutors argued it wasn't spontaneous. It was a plan that started with access and ended with control. And the access wasn't a weapon. It was a dating profile. They laid out the timeline, the drive, the basement in Wilbur, the possibility that Sydney learned about Trail down there and couldn't outrun them both, the cleanup, the disposal sites, the ways the story kept trying to stay one step ahead of the facts. And then the motive, the worldview underneath it, came into the room. Witnesses testified that Bailey used dating apps to lure women toward Trail and into what they described as a self-proclaimed family, a cult-like circle with roles and rules. And more than one witness described something darker underneath it.
Witness, please answer the question.
Talk about killing, not as a metaphor, as a goal. In the courtroom, Nebraska Public Media reported testimony that sounded like fantasy. Aubrey Trail called himself a daddy vampire, and the women around them were described as his witches. Witnesses said killing was tied to gaining power, taking what they described as an innocent life. And then 1011 Now, KOLN, also covered a former girlfriend's testimony that Bailey Boswell sounded joyful, even excited, during conversations about torture and killing. Oh, and before I forget, I think you might find this detail crazy. As the case tightened, Trail made one last desperate move for control. This time in the courtroom itself, he smuggled in a razor blade, declared Bailey innocent, and then slashed his own neck in front of the jury. But he survived, and the trial continued. Eventually, the story reached the only ending the law can offer, a verdict. Trail was convicted in 2019. A 3-judge panel later sentenced him to death in June 2021. Boswell was convicted in 2020 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in November of 2021. Years later, appeals would argue over procedure and law, but none of it changed the central truth the evidence had already established. Sydney Loofe was gone. And this is where Lurkers always lands. Not on the killers, but on the mechanism, because manipulation doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like a date that feels safe enough. Sometimes it looks like a friendly ride. Sometimes it looks like a person going public telling you they're helping, while the real story's already sealed behind a door you never saw closing. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep being you. But if you're meeting someone from an app, keep it simple. Keep it safe. Meet in public. Tell a friend exactly where you're going. Share your location. Set a check-in time. And never let a new person control the transportation or the setting. If anything feels off, tempo, pressure, rushing closeness. Trust that signal. You don't owe anyone access to you. Because Sydney's story isn't a cautionary tale about a girl who did something wrong. It's a cautionary tale because she did something normal in a world that is darker than what we think, where normal can be exploited. So remember Sydney Loofe, and remember this: it starts with access, rushed closeness, quiet isolation, a setting you didn't choose. And that's not romance. That's quite simply a strategy. Stay aware, stay present, stay safe. Hey friends, before you go, remember, if you're listening to Lurkers and you want to support the show, hit follow wherever you get your podcasts. And if your app lets you leave a quick rating or review, it genuinely helps these stories reach more people who might need them. Thank you for listening, and enjoy that wonderful week ahead of you. This episode of Lurkers was written and developed by me, Frank Battiston. Research by Christy Bowman. Production and sound design by Daniel Urdanivia.